The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on energy company obligations, examples of delivering energy efficiency in buildings and future trends. We're just going to leave a couple more minutes before starting because we see a lot of people coming online.
Hey. Hey.
So good morning, good afternoon, and welcome again. This is the webinar on energy company obligations, examples of delivering energy efficiency in buildings and future trends. This webinar is organized under the Buildings Energy Efficiency Task Group of IPEAC, the International Partnership for Energy Efficiency Cooperation, and was commissioned by the Industrial Energy Efficiency Branch of the Australian Department of the Environment and Energy. My name is Edith Bayer, and I'm joined here by my colleague Kathleen Gaffney, and by our colleagues at the Australian Department of Environment and Energy as well. Just a few housekeeping points to begin with. The platform we use is GoToWebinar. You'll automatically be muted, and you can connect to the audio via computer or via phone. The webinar will be recorded. We'll be collecting questions throughout the webinar, and we'll leave time at the end for discussion. So please feel free to type your questions into the box in the bottom of the GoToWebinar menu at any time that the question comes to you, and we'll circle back to the questions at the end. Now, without further ado, I'd like to present Suzanne Lavender from the Australian Department of the Environment and Energy to give a bit of background on the project.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the launch of this report, Energy Company Obligations, Examples of Delivering Energy Efficiency in Buildings and Future Trends. And thank you to everyone in Australia for calling in quite late in the day, and especially thank you to Edith and Kathleen. I understand it's not even dawn quite yet in Paris, so thank you very much for getting up so early. So my name is Suzanne Lavender. I'm standing in today for Stanford Harrison, who's the director of our Commercial Buildings Policy team here in the Department of Environment and Energy in Canberra. Stanford sends his apologies. He's been made unavailable at short notice. So he commissioned this report because we, as part of the Council of Australian Governments, have a trajectory for low energy buildings, and we're investigating policy options to increase energy efficiency in existing buildings. And as part of that research, the department wanted to look at energy company obligations and their intersection with retrofits of existing buildings. And for those who are not aware, the Australian jurisdictions here are leading important research on moving beyond lighting upgrades towards things like demand response and market transformation. And we're very aware that we want to support them to continually strengthen the energy services sector here in Australia and unlock all that potential of market-based instruments to overcome the upfront capital costs associated with energy efficiency and, of course, greenhouse gas abatement. So we know that there's a great case for paying special attention to the role of buildings if we want to make our future sustainable and start absorbing the impacts of changes in our economies. This report considers the changes and trends in energy efficiency obligation schemes and how they might be best used to fund buildings' energy efficiency over time. So this report has been co-authored by Kathleen Gaffney and Edith Beyer. Kathleen is a senior program manager at the IEA and an expert in energy efficiency trends, policies, and technology analysis. And she provides strategic leadership in energy policy and program planning and evaluation, market and technology assessment, and research and analysis. And I understand she's a particular expert in demand-side management, digitalization, and obligation schemes. Edith is a climate and energy policy expert at the IEA and has also considerable experience in the regulatory assistance projects, which brings together experts to examine the long-term economic and environmental sustainability of the power and gas sectors. So very used to providing policy advice to government officials. So I think we're going to hand over now to Edith and Kathleen to take us through the slides. And as they mentioned, please save your questions till the end.
Thanks a lot, Suzanne, and again, thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'd like to start just by giving a bit of an overview of some of the questions that we sought to answer in the paper. As Suzanne mentioned, the paper sets out to answer a number of questions relating to experience globally with energy company obligations, with a specific focus on the role that these obligations have played and continue to play in delivering energy efficiency in buildings. And more specifically, we were interested to see what programs are delivering beyond lighting, and to understand where the cost-effective savings are and how programs have been designed to deliver targeted or more comprehensive or deeper savings. We also considered the role that energy company obligations play in the broader framework of energy efficiency policies, and also in the framework of national and subnational competencies. We see that a lot of energy efficiency obligation schemes are in fact state, provincial schemes rather than national schemes. So we really see a combination around the globe. And we wanted to understand how these subnational programs build on national policies to deliver savings. And lastly, we wanted to take a forward look at the emerging opportunities that technology and innovation, things like smart meters, sensors, machine learning, are generating to advance energy efficiency in buildings through the lens, again, of energy company obligations. Of course, we could write 4 full-length dissertations on each topic, and still we wouldn't cover the full geographic scope or range of possibilities that are out there. What we did instead was select a sampling of experiences that help answer how some jurisdictions would answer these questions. We tried to include a range of geographic diversity and a variety of program designs. For this reason, if you don't see your favorite program here, it's not because we don't value it. It's really because of how much ground we had to cover in the paper. So we hope that the paper can provide something for everyone, an introduction to some of the concepts for those with perhaps less experience with energy company obligations and maybe more experience with things like building codes and standards, and some more in-depth analysis, particularly on the design of some of these programs, for those who might be interested in understanding some of the more detailed information. Energy company obligations are a type of policy that's often referred to as market-based instruments. The general idea of market-based instruments is that there's some form of target, and we leave it to the market to determine how that target is delivered. So what sorts of measures are implemented and are most competitive in the market. So here we have a matrix that structures this landscape of market-based instruments based on the extent to which funding is or is not set in advance. So is there a fixed budget for a fixed period of time? And also the extent to which savings are set in advance. So is there a savings target or is there not a target? And so I'll walk through these design elements since several of the examples that we have fall kind of within this matrix. So the most structured programs have both. So they have both a predetermined level of savings, and also the amount of funding that's expected to deliver those savings is defined in advance. And so we see that most obligations that are obligating energy companies that are regulated monopolies fall within this structure. Essentially, you have a target and then you have a regulatory procedure where the regulated company estimates how much it will cost them to deliver the level of savings that's been set. And the next structure is where we have a budget, but leave it to the market to determine how many savings that budget can deliver. And so in this case, we have the example that we'll talk about a bit later of Portugal's energy efficiency auctions, where there's a fixed budget over a period of time, and then the market determines how many savings that budget can deliver. And we also see some utility-funded programs in other jurisdictions falling under this structure. We can also have a situation where there's a savings target, but the funds themselves are not predetermined. So most obligations in unbundled markets fall within this category. So essentially, market actors have to deliver a certain amount of savings, and then they go out and try to find the most cost-effective savings that they can to meet the program, the savings target. And sometimes also, as we'll see, there are some different parameters about what sectors the savings have to occur in, things like that. And then lastly, we also have situations where there's neither a savings target nor a predefined spending target, let's say. And here, a good example are capacity market auctions where energy efficiency is allowed to bid. So essentially, you have a certain amount of capacity that the system operator needs to procure, and energy efficiency is welcome to bid in as one of the resources to meet the capacity needs that have been defined. And in this case, we don't know how much efficiency is gonna clear the auction. We don't know how much that efficiency is going to cost per kilowatt hour saved. And we also see some utility-funded programs where there's a requirement for the utility to develop some form of energy savings program, but perhaps there's no fixed budget or savings target. So we see that market-based instruments are found all across the globe. We see them in North America, we see them in Europe, China, Korea, Australia, South Africa, Brazil, Uruguay. As I mentioned earlier, in a lot of cases, including Australia, Canada, United States, there's not a national scheme, rather what we see are state level or provincial level energy company obligations. So one of the reasons that we're talking about energy company obligations and that there's continued interest in them is that we see that they're really cost effective. When we look at energy company obligations around the world, we see that the median cost is between 4 and 6 cents per kilowatt hour, which is well below the typical cost of energy supplied in these jurisdictions. So the costs that you see on the slide here are a bit lower. These are the costs of delivering the program, or the costs to the utility or the other delivery agent. The full cost of the energy savings would also include a customer contribution. So imagine, to have a very oversimplified case, that you're buying an Energy Star refrigerator that has a rebate. The rebate might cover 30% of the cost of the appliance, so it tips you over into making the decision to buy that more energy efficient appliance, but you're also paying for the additional 70%. The customer contribution varies. Able to pay customers might require very little incentive to tip them over to choosing the more efficient option. Low-income consumers may require the full costs to be covered by the program. On average, we see a range of 4 to 6 cents, taking into account a leverage factor of 2 or 3. One of the key research questions that we had was, to what extent do energy efficiency obligations deliver energy savings in buildings as opposed to in industrial processes, motors, street lighting, transport, these kinds of uses? And what we see is that, in fact, most of the savings are being delivered in buildings. So this is just a snapshot where the evidence is available on the types of measures that are being implemented in different programs and jurisdictions. So we have a number of programs in Europe on the left, and on the right we have programs in Canada and the US. It's just important to note that because different programs and different jurisdictions report and structure their programs differently, it's difficult to say exactly what portion of programs are being implemented in buildings. Sometimes the reporting is blended. For instance, on the right where you see the US and Canada, you might have commercial and industrial programs bundled together, or you might have programs reported as just industrial programs, or you might have some programs covering all residential customers, but you might also have programs that define multifamily as a separate category. So what we did here was estimate roughly which measures are likely being implemented in buildings and which are likely being implemented in other end uses. The one assumption that it's important to mention is that for industry, it's really difficult to tell because we just don't have that detailed information on which measures were implemented in buildings and which were more focused on processes or improved, swapping out motors for more efficient motors, this kind of thing. So we just made the assumption that half of the industry measures are being implemented in buildings and half are not. That's quite a conservative assumption. So I'd say that the conclusion here that in Europe almost 80% of savings are achieved in buildings and more than 65% in North America is quite conservative. So the quick conclusion is we see that energy efficiency obligations are indeed delivering significant energy savings in buildings. So now I'd like to move to some of the case studies that we went into. The case studies are divided into three general categories. One is programs that were designed to deliver energy savings in buildings, and specifically focusing on how the design features steered programs into certain, to cover certain measures and certain sectors. Then we have energy efficiency obligations in a federal system. So a lot of obligation programs are at subnational level. So how do those interact with national frameworks? And lastly, we wanted to take a forward look at some of the emerging opportunities that we see through technology and policy innovation. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about the energy company obligations in Great Britain. I'll try to be brief, although there's a lot here. So the first point is just to say that Great Britain has one of the longest standing energy company obligations in the world. It started in 1994 and has continued through a number of phases through the present. The objectives of the program over time have been social and environmental. So from an early stage, the energy efficiency obligation was designed to help Great Britain meet its broader carbon goals. But there also has been there's also been a big focus on ensuring that part of the program always covers low-income consumers. And so you can see that over time, there have been different carve-outs for low-income consumers within the program. You'll see that here there are a couple of shaded areas in the second row under targets. So the Great Britain programs really ramped up kind of between the EEC, which is the Energy Efficiency Commitment, and the CERT, which was the Community Energy Savings Program. So like a lot of programs, the UK program started small and kind of built up over time. And over the past few years, the program has contracted a bit, but we saw some really ambitious savings levels in the highlighted periods that you see. The main measures that have been implemented, and this responds to one of the questions we had about what sorts of measures are being implemented outside of lighting, which is often the measure that springs to mind as the cheapest option. There's been a lot of focus on cavity wall and loft insulation, which aren't always the cheapest measures, but are the measures that add a lot of value given the structure of the UK housing stock and where the energy savings opportunities are. And what we see is that this focus on insulation was really driven by uplift measures within the structure of the obligation. So uplift here refers to essentially a percentage increase in the carbon savings attributed to a measure. So under the EESOP, which stands for the Energy Efficiency Standards of Performance Program, measures delivered as a package, so where you had more than one measure, were eligible for extra credit, but with a limit for uplift measures of 10% of each supplier's target. So here there are two elements worth highlighting. One is that package measures received an uplift, but also that there was a cap, and that cap was really to address the concern of the cost implications of focusing on these more expensive measures. Then we see under the EEC2, the second phase of the energy efficiency commitment, packaged measures and innovative measures qualified for a 50% uplift, but again were capped at 10% of all savings. And then another example under the CERT, the carbon emissions reduction target, energy companies could receive an uplift of 245% for ground source heat pumps, 95% for internal solid wall insulation, and 175% for external solid wall insulation. So you can see how also the design of the uplift varied over time. So another example that we looked at was Portugal, also because Portugal has quite a long-standing program. Since 2007, the Portuguese electricity regulator has administered a voluntary auction scheme for electric energy savings called the Electric Demand Side Efficiency Promotion Program. I won't try to pronounce the PPEC, what it stands for in Portuguese, but essentially it's the Plan for Promotion of Efficiency of Consumption of Electric Energy. So the letters align roughly. The program has had 6 auction periods starting in 2007. Each period begins with a tender for energy efficiency programs, followed by an implementation period. And the most recent period was for 2017-18 and is currently under implementation. Portugal has approached, has structured its program a bit differently to steer the projects in criteria. So essentially, if you look at the percent weight. So each is weighted equally. One is technical and economic weighting factors, essentially cost effectiveness factors, and the second is energy policy objectives. So how well does a bid coming in align with the broader policy objectives, including energy efficiency, but also energy policy objectives. And then under the blue are the technical economic considerations. And here, a proportional benefit cost analysis is really used to compare investments that are quite different. So with different investment amounts and different lifetimes. So there's this one cost benefit indicator, and then ordered cost benefit analysis is a way that the Portuguese regulator kind of ranks the cost benefit of different projects. And those are the predominant weighting factors within the cost benefit side of the calculation. And then on the policy side, you see that there's alignment with national energy policy and legislation. There's alignment with national energy efficiency policy and legislation. We also see support and development and implementation of measures to promote energy efficiency and diversification of promoters, which actually has kicked in more recently, which I'll show in a moment. So now if you look at the left, you can see the different program periods, and you can see that as most programs actually, as we see, they start a bit smaller and then they ramp up over time. So in 2000, 2008, there was a smaller budget allocation of about 10 million euros, and then that more than doubled in 2009 and 2010, and that budget level has continued over time. So looking at this differently, this is the share of different measures as a share of total measures implemented under different program periods, and we can see that as, for instance, as more weighting factors have been introduced to encourage non-electricity sector companies to participate in the program, which is the orange that you see on the right, we see an expansion of the participation of projects implemented by actors outside of the usual suspects, so to speak. So traditionally, it's been the electricity companies that have been implementing these programs. And we also see that there's been a shift away from residential programs, which are still there but have decreased in the overall share, and an expansion of programs in industry and agriculture. So now turning to Canada, we could have chosen any number of states actually for this comparison. There are a lot of examples in Australia, in the US, and Canada of subnational energy efficiency programs. But we wanted to show a bit of geographic diversity. So here we have two programs, Nova Scotia and Ontario. And on the left, you can see that they meet this criterion that we said at the beginning of energy company obligations that are really focused on implementing energy efficiency in buildings. So most measures have been implemented in residential and commercial buildings. The graphic on the right is really one of the more interesting ones that we found. This comes from Ontario's program. Ontario's energy company obligation fell under a broader framework called the Conservation First Framework. And the framework was laid out for 2015 to 2020, the goal to reduce 8.7 terawatt hours in electricity consumption by 2020. Most of the measures are delivered by distribution companies, but some also by the independent electricity system operator. And what's interesting here is that we can see this kind of retrospective and prospective interaction between different policies over time. So the yellow, this chart doesn't just show energy company obligations, it shows the full kind of landscape of different policy instruments driving energy efficiency in Ontario. So the yellow really shows historical program persistence. So you see the savings tapering off over time, but essentially you see kind of the lifetime of different savings as they continue over time. And as they taper off, then you see the light blue at the bottom are codes and standards implemented by 2015. So you see the market actually reacting to the year that the standard is going to kick in ahead of time. So you see some early market actors, and then you see this ramp up and the persistence of savings after the implementation of the standards in 2015. The orange are codes and standards implemented in 2016 and beyond. So again, you see kind of a gradual uptick in savings being driven by changes in the codes and standards. The dark blue are forecast savings from planned programs between 2016 and 2020, and these include energy company obligations. So here you see kind of this overlay of the building codes and standards are delivering a certain level of savings, and now these programmatic savings are coming on top of that and driving additional savings. And the green, again, are planned savings from future programs. So this is looking forward to the effect of programs that are projected but maybe weren't in place in 2018 when this graphic was published. So the conclusion here really is that we see that energy company obligations integrate with other policies. They can be complementary to these other policies. And we see this in different jurisdictions, but not always quite as clearly as this visual depicts. So we also wanted to cover innovations and opportunities that advanced metering and diagnostic tools offer to more accurately uncover savings measure savings, and in this way to develop new market opportunities for savings. These kinds of metered savings are being implemented oftentimes under something called pay-for-performance programs. Pay-for-performance programs pay for energy savings as they accrue over time. And while some pay-for-performance programs, in fact, continue to base payments on deemed savings, we really wanted to focus here on programs that utilize performance-based payments tied to actual metered savings. Just a note on kind of what's driving some of these changes. So we can say that there are three factors generally that have enabled growth in the importance and accessibility of the technologies needed to roll out these programs on a broader scale. So on the one hand, we see technology. There are smart meters, sensors, advanced data analytics, all of which are providing new opportunities to measure and manage energy consumption. And this is something that this year's Energy Efficiency Market Report addresses, that was launched earlier this week, and that's available online as well. We also see that many energy efficiency programs have now covered the lower cost, easily replicable measures, such as lighting and HVAC, which isn't to say that those measures, that there aren't opportunities to improve lighting in certain jurisdictions, but in some of the more advanced programs in particular, we see that a lot of the lighting has already been done, and that lighting standards have caught up to where we see LEDs being kind of the dominant technology in the market. So policymakers have the challenge of identifying policies that can deliver deeper savings. And then we also see growing capacities of variable renewable energy resources on electricity systems. And these are creating a need for more efficient and responsive demand. So this is also pushing policymakers to consider how digital technologies and metering can really enhance energy savings and target energy savings in a way that aligns more closely with the needs of the electricity system. So here's an example from Texas. Texas has had an energy company obligation in place since 2001, and the programs have for years included a significant component of program delivery that includes standard offer programs. Typically, standard offered programs set a fixed payment for the amount of energy or peak capacity savings achieved, often through multi-year contracts. And in Texas, there are four main types of standard offer programs, and you see them reflected here in the slide. So there are commercial, residential, and small commercial, low income, and load management programs. Load management here refers to control activities that result in a reduction in peak demand or shifting energy use from an off-peak period to from an on-peak period to an off-peak period. So really, the red here are more demand response programs. And I think there are 2 points to make on Texas here. One is that pay for performance isn't necessarily something that's new. It's something that as Texas shows us, has been in place for many years. But it's something that now is being revisited in a lot of jurisdictions, because we see both kind of the pressure to see what more we can get out of digital technologies, and there's also more pressure to introduce more flexibility into power systems. And I think it's also important to point out that that standard offer programs can also be designed within an efficiency obligation to deliver savings in certain categories. So Texas has had a requirement that at least 10% of the obligated utilities energy efficiency budget be applied to improvements in low-income households. So here, as in the UK, the program has sort of maintained a carve-out for low-income consumers, including in this program where it's more based on metered savings. We also wanted to include a specific example of a pay-for-performance model where we can see the metered savings being directly integrated into the energy efficiency program under a utility-run obligation program. So this is an example from Illinois. Commonwealth Edison is a utility, the largest electric utility in Illinois, and under its utility obligation and under its energy company obligation, it's required to meet a cumulative target of 21.5% cumulative persisting annual savings for the year ending December 31st, 2030. And under this obligation, Commonwealth Edison has implemented several programs, and one of the most innovative, I would say, is the retro commissioning program, which is the largest retro commissioning program in the US. So for those who are less familiar with the term, retro commissioning optimizes the energy performance of existing facilities, of existing buildings, by identifying the cost-effective operational improvements for control of major energy using systems like heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and lighting. So the program, ComEd's program, includes 4 options for different sized customers, as you can see here, and different implementation models as summarized in the table. So essentially, you can see that there are different packages for different sized buildings. But the interesting features here, the interesting feature really to point out for purposes of this paper and the discussion, is that we see performance-based incentives for verified kilowatt-hour savings. So we can see also the savings levels across different building types, the average energy savings. We see that there are incentives that are specifically structured around sort of the evidence of the savings, the metered savings. And we also see that the payback is good. So the project payback period is less than 1.5 years for implemented energy improvements. And we see actually a lot of examples, not necessarily of retro commissioning, but of business models that are based on measured metered savings. And the evidence is kind of growing of how those programs are delivering. But I think it's still a kind of growing area of evidence to see how these programs are evolving, what sorts of business models are coming out, and how exactly the metered savings are being leveraged to create the value for both the delivery agent and for the customer themselves. So now I want to turn to New York. This slide is a bit of a conceptual slide that represents some of the regulatory changes that are happening in New York under a broader policy called the Reforming Energy Vision. The Reforming Energy Vision, or often referred to as REV, has set 2030 targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, delivering electricity, 70% of electricity through renewable resources by 2030, and also increasing statewide energy efficiency. So it's quite an ambitious program. And there was a realization that in order to deliver on these targets, and particularly on the energy efficiency portion, it's going to be important to make the system more flexible, to respond to the increasing share of variable renewable resources on the system, and also just to rethink how utilities make money, to rethink the utility business model. So to help achieve these ambitious carbon, renewables, and efficiency goals, a number of regulatory reforms are underway, and I'll just note that they're not completed yet. The reforms include incentives for a range of customer-side resources, including energy efficiency, and they build on decades of experience in New York in delivering utility-funded energy efficiency programs. So a couple of the features here. First, if you look at the red, this is the traditional cost of service regulation. So that over time is the share of revenues coming from the kind of traditional revenue model is expected to decrease over time as some more performance-based, innovative revenue recovery mechanisms come into place. So one of those is the earning adjustment mechanism, which is in orange, and this attempts to better align incentives according to the objectives of the clean energy objectives of New York. So it includes earning adjustments, so some sort of positive additional earnings for implementing measures such as energy efficiency. And then we see also something called platform service revenues, which are new forms of revenues that utilities are expected to earn from displacing traditional infrastructure projects like building a new substation or expanding the distribution network or reinforcing the distribution network to what are called non-wires alternatives. So things like energy efficiency, demand response, even distributed solar. So, so while this is quite a complicated picture, I'll just note that there's actually a lot of good information for those who are interested on the New York regulators and state website. It's quite well documented, and there are a lot of details on the regulatory process, where they are, what these very technical sounding terms mean in more detail. And in the paper, we also explain a bit more about how this is being implemented in practice. And I'll just mention, to give you a concrete example, one example from New York, which is the Brooklyn-Queens demand-side management project. So essentially, the utility developed, Commonwealth Edison developed a proposal to address the need for 41 megawatts of load relief. And they combined a combination of utility side solutions and non-traditional utility side solutions to more cost effectively address the increasing load on the system. So essentially the distribution system was overloaded, and rather than just investing directly in the distribution system, which would be the usual kind of the traditional route, the utility also proposed to the regulator to implement a number of demand side measures to help reduce the overall cost. So the regulator, the Department of Public Service, approved the proposal with a $200 million budget. The project was successfully implemented and deferred the need for a substation upgrade that would have cost $1.2 billion. And this was accomplished through a combination of investments in energy efficiency, in demand response, and in distributed solar PV. And that program, the first phase of that program has finished. So that's where we get these numbers from. But in 2017, the New York regulator approved an extension of the program. So this work continues to uncover the potential to reduce the need for more costly investments in traditional grid infrastructure, and to focus more on what can be accomplished through demand side flexibility, energy savings, and distributed solar. So we cover a few other examples in the paper. I'm not going to go into all of them in detail. A lot of the examples, particularly on the innovation side, are more introductions, I would say, to some of the developments that we're seeing in terms of business models enabled by new technologies. So we encourage you to read the paper. It's up online. We'll send around a link after the webinar. But I'd like to now present a few of the conclusions that we came out with, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. We're going to take the questions. We're not going to unmute people, so we'd like to ask you if you have some questions in mind to start typing them as I go through the conclusions into the questions box, and we'll kind of facilitate from here, reading them out and answering them as best we can. So one of the conclusions is that we see some of the designs some of the energy efficiency obligations are designed in a way that aligns schemes with broader policy goals that target the building sector. So we saw this with the weighting factors in the UK, and we saw this very clearly in the auction designs in Portugal, and there are a lot of other programs out there that do similar things. Another conclusion is that the scheme design can be adapted to improve where measures are targeted. So in the UK, certain types of measures were targeted, but there's a tension here also that the UK addressed with the 10% cap on innovative or more expensive measures. There's a tension between the role that a lot of people see in energy company obligations uncovering the cheapest energy savings and also trying to go for deeper savings. We also see that energy company obligations can help accelerate and enable national codes and standards to reach higher levels of ambition over time. So if you think about it in terms of push and pull, you have national codes and various appliance standards kind of pushing the market and pushing off the least efficient models, pushing them out of the market. But at the same time, it's difficult to, the market eventually will reach some sort of status. So you want to make sure that there are programs in place that help push the ambition and pave the way to revise up codes and standards over time. And I think this is clear, among other things, in the graphic that we showed from Canada. We also see that energy company obligations can play an important role in reducing key barriers and further enabling energy efficiency market development. So in Great Britain, for instance, the policy structure and the weighting factors really drove a significant expansion of the insulation market and enabled insulation providers to gain a foothold in the market. An unfortunate lesson more recently is that when the program ramped down and those incentives weren't available anymore, it created a lot of problems for the insulation market. So I think it's also important to keep in mind the role of policy and policy stability in both building up a market and also helping to maintain it over time. In Portugal, we saw that the incentive for kind of the non-incumbent players, market actors, to participate in the scheme. And in the US, we see varying coverage costs based on different customer segments. So we see higher costs for low-income consumers and lower for commercial buildings. And we see that energy company obligations also play an important role in overcoming barriers to implementing measures in harder-to-reach sectors, and also expanding market opportunities for different customer segments, which oftentimes also correlates with different measures, different energy efficiency measures. And lastly, but not least, we see a lot of opportunities for innovation and also for innovation to improve reliability and expand the value of energy savings, including as a resource to energy systems. We saw this with the examples of Illinois and Texas and New York. We also in the paper talk about some of the regulatory innovations in California and some of the market opportunities that are coming out there. So thank you all for your attention, and we'll turn now to questions.
Yep, thanks Edith. This is Kathleen. That was a great summary of the paper. We have one question that came in while you were concluding there, and it's from Marilyn Smith, and she was asking, how could we use the findings from this paper, or just in general, what kind of evidence do we have to help convince governments, particularly in the EU, to implement policy that will help capture the energy and emissions reductions potential from deep renovation in buildings? So that was a very good question. I think that was also on the minds of the people who commissioned the paper. So we've given it a little bit of thought. I don't know, Edith, you want to sum up where we come out on that?
Yeah, I can start, and Kathleen, you can fill in if there's something more. But I mean, we don't see an energy company obligation anywhere that's implementing comprehensive deep retrofits. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. The programs kind of have this balance of identifying the most cost-effective measures, but also not just cream skimming. So we see in the UK, and in particular, this example of incentivizing combined measures or specific measures like insulation that are less cost effective than some of the cheapest things like lighting. So, I mean, energy company obligations can certainly can be a complement to broader programs focused on deep retrofits, but in the end, I would say that they would play a complementary role, and you would require kind of other programs to work with them. And we do see examples of where energy company obligations, it's not quite a deep retrofit example, but in the UK, there were a couple of phases of the program where the program was implemented along with public housing agencies, and so funds were kind of combined to help reduce the cost under the energy efficiency obligation of delivering savings in the hard-to-reach sectors, and they were helped out by the funds that were available through some of the social housing providers.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add that maybe not in the EU, but in the US, where the portfolios of programs that the utilities are running are so huge, often there are some attempts to include deep retrofit programs within that portfolio. I think in particular in California, I mean, I'm old enough to have seen it happen twice, but, you know, they go through phases where the measures are viewed, you know, to be too much of a cream skimming opportunity, and then they move into the deep retrofit phase, and the level of participation goes down, and the cost effectiveness of the overall programs go down, and then they swing back up to acquire, you know, cheaper resources. So I would say only when your portfolio is big enough can you really afford to have that kind of diversity within it. And, you know, I think there is an opportunity for these programs to help pull the market for renovation, just like any other technologies, but it has to be blended within, I think, a broader portfolio for it to kind of survive the other obligations that you have to meet savings targets or cost effectiveness. And then, okay, one more question from Stanford. So he's just asking, have we seen a difference in obligation schemes that have promoted gas versus electricity measures? And I'd say, especially in the US, there's definitely a mixture of both. I think it's certainly applicable to both types of measures. It really depends on which type of fuel the utility is obligated to deliver. I think the same would be the case in the UK. I think recently we're starting to see, at least in the US, there used to be, in some states, there used to be a prohibition prohibiting fuel switching as a measure. So if you were an electric only utility, you couldn't be or gas and electric, I'm sorry, utility, you couldn't be promoting one fuel over the other. Whereas now with the electrification goals in California, for example, fuel switching, as long as it's shown to be net efficient in the environment where those measures are being implemented, it can be allowed. So I think I would watch this space on that kind of an activity now as more and more portfolios move towards sort of decarbonization goals as opposed to just energy savings. Okay, the next question we have comes from Jay Williams, and this is a question about Australia's circumstances. So he says, in Western Australia, there is an oversupply of supply capacity and hence a reluctance to invest in measures aimed at reducing overall demand. Reducing peak demand is, however, more of an interest, and low-income assistance as well. So any comments with regard to a retailer obligation scheme in this context? And I think the New York example that Edith presented is a good example. There's certainly examples of this in California. And if I'm not mistaken, it's a clear path that is being taken in New South Wales as well. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll only add to that on the low-income assistance. I mean, we see a lot of energy company obligations with a low-income assistance aspect, and oftentimes it ties to the issue of equity of kind of ensuring that all customer classes benefit from the energy company obligation. So certainly, energy company obligations can play a big role in targeting low-income households.
Yeah, and more, and this is possibly related to the next comment from Chester Lee about, he's saying, how have programs valued peak demand reductions versus energy efficiency measures? Has this changed the duck curve, meaning changing the daily demand profile and not just summer peak? So I think, as Chester probably knows, there's some early evidence from utility programs in California that are trying to change their design to address energy savings at different points of the day, to affect the neck of the duck curve, if you will, the sort of nighttime ramp up. And they're doing that through, so they have an obligation scheme, and what they've done is they've required the utilities to go out to bid for a certain portion of that portfolio, and in those third-party solicitations, there was an encouragement to bring back ideas for how to address peak and how to address the time and locational value of energy savings. So it could be at different times of day, and different locations have different needs, and so they've created a way to give that signal to the market in terms of where those values exist, what times of day and which locations. And then the third-party solicitations that came back have all kind of responded to that, and there's a different incentive level depending on where you can target your measures. So as we've seen through the obligation schemes, they did a relatively decent job being able to shift from, basically lighting-only programs to more comprehensive or more substantial measures, perhaps, say, in the insulation cases, or then they've been able to cover a range of different buildings types. They've been able to address targets for low income, and now they're evolving to be able to address different needs on the system. And it seems like because of the flexible nature of the market-based instrument, those types of changes have made it easier, I think, in many jurisdictions to make those changes. They've happened faster. They haven't involved a lot of start and stop. But on the other hand, when one thing shifts and the other thing gets left behind, like in the case of the UK, you start to see, certain parts of the market collapsing or having different problems. And so I would say, as we move towards peak savings, let's be clear that there's still going to be a need for supporting markets that are delivering, better housing stock, better building stock across the service territory, especially in places where there's still a lot of work to be done in that regard. It's more important now that those objectives get integrated and that the programs get designed to allow for that conflict or tension, and not necessarily kind of separate and collapse one aspect to deliver the other.
Yeah, and just a couple of additional points. I mean, I think that there's also an important kind of regulatory point to be made, which is that I think energy company obligations at the start were more focused on just delivering energy savings without consideration for when those savings are happening. But as we see with the process in New York, and actually we see this process in a lot of jurisdictions where there's a lot of interest in what's called performance or incentive-based regulation. The UK has its RIO framework. New York has REV, but actually there are a number of other states in the US that are also looking at how to shift the utility business model, and that can align and should align, I would say, with energy company obligations. The other point is that for anybody who's in a market where demand is really growing, and here we see major emerging economies, for instance, it's important to keep in mind that energy efficiency still has this fundamental role of that's not as sensitive to kind of the time of savings, to just serving to control kind of or mitigate the impact of growth in overall demand on the electricity system. So that's important to keep in mind, especially in a market where you have a lot of uptake of appliances. You have expanding floor area for households, things like this that have a really big impact on the system.
Which in our latest market report, we've attributed to the sort of recent slowdown of energy intensity or energy efficiency. A lot of it is not the sort of rate of improvement in efficiency worldwide is not able to keep up with that growth anymore. So while new measurement activity and new smart meters and AMI and everything are able to help advanced economies target where efficiency can have the most benefit, we still need to remember that globally there's still a need to move forward with more traditional policies. So that was it. We got through all the questions, and we ran right on time. So I don't know if
thank you everyone for joining. And this is just a reminder that the webinar has been recorded, and we'll send around a link to the recording. So if you have colleagues who weren't able to join, or you want to revisit the webinar, you'll be able to. And we'll also send around a link to the report, which is up online and available, of course, free of charge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.